Why are two of the best aim supports in the history of Overwatch League not running Illari? What's the deal with Houston Outlaws? Now, the first thing is that the Scrimbucks said that they weren't particularly good at Illari. No idea why, read into that as you will. But it's worth pointing out that even though they're not running Illari right now, that they're still having success running these different support compositions. How are they doing it? Well, to understand why you would not run Illari, we need to understand why you would run Illari. And the large part of her impact in the Scrim meta early on, even before the nerf and after the nerf. Three things that made Illari help kill dive, or at least kill the Sombra Tracer variant. The first off is her shift, the ability to knock back people and move her around. Obviously, defensive mobility like this is always good, especially when there's mobility, when there's a boop on the enemy team at the same time. The pylon was the really big one, especially in 1v1s versus flankers. It takes way too long to focus the Illari while she's getting healed. It does too much healing per second. But then if you focus the pylon, by the time you break the pylon, the Illari's already killed you or forced you out. It takes way too long to break, even after the nerf. The other thing that's obviously a big deal at the Overwatch League level is that really hurts. Now, it's not exactly a one-shot, but it's pretty close to a one-shot. Even a body shot damage has a significant amount of damage. So for these low HP divers, Sombra Tracer, Genjis, things like that, it's pretty easy to clear out. So when you're running Illari, it's the threat of Illari has kind of not killed dive, but made a lot of variations very, very difficult to run. So then how are they still finding success running dive, or at least variations of dive? Now you can make an argument that they were playing the Vegas Eternal, not the most challenging team. But I think there's a chance that we're going to continue to see these variations of dive from teams that want to force dive, and I want to analyze why. So if you're not running Illari, or if you're trying to dive into Illari, if she's the anti-dive character, how do you make it work? Well, let's actually pull up some footage here and let's talk about this. So there's a really interesting thing that Kiriko provides, and the fact that she's not just a dive character, she's also a spam character that can take angles. A dive character doesn't mean to be somebody that has to play at point blank range. A dive character can also utilize their mobility to spam. Echo is a great example of this, and even to an extent, Genji and the way that he's operating this meta is kind of a hybrid of those two things. So if we're going to look at the Vegas Eternal, and the first couple of timestamps, I just want to actually pull up and make sure this is actually working. Yeah, I just want to actually pull up the compositions. We're not going to be analyzing the composition, but if you look at this here, this is like the most anti-dive composition that you could possibly think of. You have the Batiste, who's able to live on his own and heal his tank, heal his DPS. You have Soldier, who has mobility. You have Torbjorn, who has mobility, and you have the Illari, who's obviously a bit of an angler herself, and it prevents other people from diving on her. But you notice the Houston Outlaws backline. We already know Viol2t's a phenomenal flex support. We already know that Viol2t's a phenomenal Kiriko. And so then now, if we're going to run a flanker or a dive composition, we're actually going to run it with Ana and Kiriko. And the dive is not through jumping onto the middle of the enemy backline, but actually taking the entire map away by taking multiple different angles. And this is something that I'm always talking about, angles, 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 but this is the key to the Houston Outlaws composition. Shu pockets fearless, Pelican and Happy can take angles. Happy is pretty self-sufficient, which is really important. And then Violet and Pelican can work as a hit squad together. And because Pelican doesn't have to worry about the pylon, sustaining forever, because he actually has a support with him. That's the key thing that Kiriko provides. Kiriko can actually go with the Tracer, with the Echo, with the Genji, with the Soldier, with whatever dive DPS that you want, and sustain them to poke down and eventually whittle down the Illari's cooldowns so that then they are diveable. And you see this frequently with Violet. Okay, you can't, the pylon's too big of an issue for a solo Tracer. Well, what about a Tracer plus a Kiriko? It's too annoying as a Sombra or a Winston. Well, what about a Kiriko plus a Winston? And that's something that consistently the Outlaws were doing, and even to an extent with Violent going by himself. And the same thing happens here. Now, they actually lost this round, but again, you can kind of see the composition where they're going to lean into a dive or a pokey dive variation where they actually have very, very mobile heroes taking multiple angles, but Violet is on that flank supporting them. There isn't any other support that can do that. The only thing that can do anything remotely close to this is Mercy, actually. Mercy. Back in the day, I remember there was sometimes in Overwatch League or Pro Overwatch or even just ranked games, you'd see a very, very heavy bunker composition, and sometimes you run a dive character like Genji with a Mercy. And now Kiriko does that, but does that better. Where she lacks the damage boost, she provides her own damage at the same time and is a lot harder to nail down. Now, this is, again, you can see it continues here. This time it's with a Winston. This is a pretty good Winston map, but you can see it. It's not just the dive characters, it's the dive characters plus the Kiriko taking the angle. You don't need the Brig anymore because there's no threat of Sombra or Tracer on the enemy team. And if they do go Sombra Tracer, well, then you go Illari. See, it's just as much the threat of Illari that's enabling Kiriko to be played as it is the Illari herself. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to actually show just a couple of examples here. This time they're actually going to run Tracer. Tracer's really strong in this map. Notice that they're running DPS. They can take angles to break Pylon, whether that's the Echo or Tracer. Again, neither of these characters could do this very successfully without a support that could go with them. And that's exactly what Kiriko provides. So you're going to actually see Vegas slowly get surrounded and off to the corner here. Tracer here. Watch Violet. Violet's already on the flank. He's off on his own. And there's the Tracer with him, right? So while they're being pushed in the front line, Violet and Tracer on the back line. And while you might think, oh, well, then Pylon or Peel could keep Dove alive, theoretically, they could have peeled off Dove better here. But the key thing with the Kiriko Tracer combo is you can't just clear the Tracer out. Tracer will stay. You can't get rid of them because she has her own pocket with her. And that's what Kiriko does. Again, we're going to see a little bit more of that here. Oh, that's the wrong timestamp. So we're going to see, I think it's more... Yeah, so it's again like here where it's actually Violet's not just contesting a flank from an angle, he's also stopping the enemy team from taking angles. And obviously when you have Violet's level of mechanics, he's just going to win those 1v1. So it's insane. Now, let's talk about actually the weakness here. Actually, I'm going to go back and pull up that previous timestamp. Let's talk about the potential weakness out of running this, because if it was so good, why aren't all the other teams running it? And I think there's an important answer to that. Look at what Dove swaps to after dying on Ashe. She's going to go Tracer. Now, that's probably to get cut back and try and touch before the fight's lost. That's the most important reason. But I actually do think it's a good swap. You see, the problem with running this, as we said, is that it does mean that Kiriko and Tracer, Kiriko Echo, Kiriko whatever, are going to be on the flank, on the angle, contesting backline, contesting DPS. This means Shu's by himself. Now, if you are playing versus an S tier, really, really good Tracer, no disrespect to Dove, but a top level Tracer, is that going to be a problem? I think the answer might be yes. It's certainly going to be a lot more tricky than just running it with an Ana Brig. And I think that's one of the questions here is, our team's going to find out a way to go, hey, you can't put your Kiriko on the flank all the time because our solo Tracer will find a way to go and access your backline. Dove is not super successful at that in this particular fight. Shu does a great job keeping himself alive, but that is one of the things that you have to actually do if you're going to run this successfully. You have to keep and leave your Ana by herself, and she has to be okay by herself. If she's not, then she's going to struggle. Another important question to ask is, how do Kiriko versus Illari on a flank? How does that 1v1 or 2v2 go? In this particular example, we're going to have an Echo and an Illari on an angle. Kiriko plus Tracer on an angle, or Kiriko plus Echo. A little bit of help here, but I think like these kind of engagements right here, obviously Fearless comes in and it's kind of a cheat here, but this is like a really, really interesting question to me. It's like, is it a skill matchup? Is Illari's Pylon a little bit too inconsistent with the healing support? Is Illari's lack of ranged healing hurt her ability to support something like an Echo or Tracer? Because remember, the whole point of Illari is that she has to deny the dive. But the irony is that when we talk about anti-dive heroes, whether it's a Brig or even a Kiriko to an extent, they also enable dives really well with their ability to range heal. But that's something that Illari does not have. That's the one thing that she doesn't have, is she can deny dives, but she denies dives very selfishly. I am hard to kill. I can boop you back. I can shoot you, but you can't help other people do that unless they're point blank range, and that's not it's not very helpful. And then I think it's obviously interesting to note here as well that we're going to see the Winston variation, the swap here. That's, again, this is the kind of composition that you're going to see dive being played into Illari. You look at the composition from Vegas and you're like, could they just not go Illari? Well, I'm not so sure that would still be successful, because you're thinking, oh, I can deny these divers with Pylon, but now every diver has that extra battery strapped onto them with Violet on the flank too. I'm not so sure that it's going to work. So I think this is where, at least in compositional theory, this dive can still work on many maps, whether that's an Echo Tracer, Echo Genji, Tracer Genji, whatever. The question is what is the quality of team playing it right now, and or really how strong is Illari? I think that's the key question here. Obviously, there's a little bit of novelty buff where everybody might think Illari is strong, and maybe she is strong, but we just don't know. But I will say that if we're going to see these dive compositions moving forward, it's probably going to be with a support combination that looks something like this. Okay. Last thing I want to point out is a little bit of a segue from the Ana Kiriko, but it's again going to be talking about like, okay, why are we seeing these support variations? You see, there's one other way to beat Illari besides pairing a dive support like Kiriko with the DPS on her. The other way to beat Illari is to just get on top of her, to Lucio speed on top of her. You see, Illari is good until there's a tank involved in the trade. And she's actually a little bit squishy. She can be run over quite easily. There's a lot of teams that I think are going to try to run Zarya compositions, Reinhardt compositions, anything with Lucio speed just to directly run her over. If you don't give her time to poke out, if you don't give her pylon a lot of value through slow, sustained healing per second, then she's not particularly useful. Even things like barriers blocking her ultimate are kind of a problem. So you're going to see, I think, a lot of teams who have probably run various Illari compositions on Watchpoint or Flashpoint, excuse me, King of the Hill, migrate back to Lucio compositions whenever the map allows people to get on top of each other. For example, if you look at Vegas Eternal's composition, why are they not running in Illari with Soldier and Junker Queen and Torbjorn? And I think the answer for many of these teams, besides hero strengths, who knows, is that I think on a map like this, not only is Lucio speed very helpful, but I think it's a little bit easier to rotate on top of the backline than it is in some of the other hybrid or escort maps. That's the key thing, is if you can't keep them at a distance with Illari, you're just going to get run over. That explains things like these Kiriko Lucio compositions where whether run with a Winston or Doomfist, if you're able to get on top of the target, Illari survivability is not that good, not when compared to other supports. So hope that makes any sense. There's a couple of questions that really remain to be seen here. First off, is the threat of Illari enough to deny dive? In other words, is the Illari really good, consistently good versus these Tracer, Genji, Echo, Winston compositions? Obviously, at least in Scrimbucks earlier in the season, that was the case. Will that maintain the case as teams get better and better? That remains to be seen. We might migrate ourselves back to a dive composition. How consistent is this Lucio variation? Obviously, it's good on maps where Lucio's speed is good. At least it looks good. But will we see this migrate to non-push maps, Flashpoint maps, non-King of the Hill maps? Is this a composition that we might see even on an escort? Is Lucio speed going to be good enough versus the Illari for it to actually function? Again, remains to be seen. And then how will teams without double flex support work? Because obviously with the variation that we're talking about, you need to have an Ana and a Kiriko player. And a lot of teams don't have that. And I think how they're able to adjust around that shortcoming might be a bit of a meta developer beyond that. And I guess the last question for me is also, are there any other support combos that are also potentially not being tried out yet? Is Zen even a possibility? Because Zen is obviously a hero that can spam just as good as an Illari, if not even better. He's just a little bit more fragile. But if Sombra and Tracer, at least by themselves, have really fallen out of the meta, then maybe we start to see some more Zenyatta back. I don't expect that to be the case, but there's a lot of combinations that are possible here. Maybe you could even run like a Batiste Kiriko in certain circumstances. There's a lot of combinations that are still available. For now, when you're watching Overwatch League, keep an eye on whether teams are running dive, what that support lineup is, and how does it deal with Illari. If you can answer that question, you might be able to answer a whole lot more questions about where the Overwatch League meta is actually going to be going. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Definitely a strange video, but I think there's a lot of guesswork that remains to be had about how the rest of the season and the playoffs are going to be going. I'll chat with you in the next video.